I'm an addict. My name is Bob. I know that you've all been sitting for a couple of hours, so I'm not offended if you need to go take care of business. I want to thank Lynn for sharing that wonderful message of recovery. I want to thank the, Entertainment Committee for that wonderful welcome for the co speaker and I. Very nice of you to do that for us. I don't think I've been at an opening ceremony of a convention quite as illustrious as the one I was privileged to view tonight, and I thank the committee for doing that. It was great. I want to thank the programming committee for taking a chance and asking me to come and join you this weekend and being a part of this opening meeting. And it truly is a privilege to be here. It's not as cold as I thought it would be. Getting here was a little more difficult than I anticipated because I'm one of those kind of addicts that know everything. And because I'm originally from the East Coast and I got clean in the state of Connecticut, and I used to buy a lot of drugs in Montreal, I thought I knew where I was going. I ended up at the Governor's Hotel downtown Montreal, and they had a black and blue something or other going on there. I went into the bathroom and I wanted to know what the third hand was about. Anyways, I'm really glad to be here. What I always like to do is to ask if anybody got clean before October 15th, 1984. Would you please stand up? Before October 15th. If you got 16 years or more, I know we're not supposed to put people on pedestals in Narcotics Anonymous, but anybody got clean before that date, you're my hero. And I say that sincerely because if things go well for the next 9 days, a week from Sunday, I'll have 16 years clean in narcotics. And I say that primarily because of the theme of this convention. I'm grateful that they kept it simple for me. 2 English letters and 4 Canadian letters, we. Because as I talk about my journey into recovery in Narcotics Anonymous, I will share a little bit about the difficulties I had going all kinds of places. I've had 21 treatment failures, had 13 years of methadone, and I got clean when I finally found Narcotics Anonymous in 1984. It was an amazing journey. I was born and raised in a small town called Bristol, Connecticut. My father was a police officer, and when I was 10 years old, he put me in jail for doing the kind of things that I think that we all did as children. I used to come home with bicycles, didn't belong to me. I scammed at an early age. I had a newspaper route early in the morning, and I would drop off the newspaper and pick up the milkman money. I was performing a community service. I was a kind of young person that when all my friends would pick up pop bottles, soda bottles, and bring them to the store and get candy, I would just go around the back of the store and get a whole box and bring them around the front. And if there was no bottles to bring around the front, I just stole the candy. It didn't make any difference to me. So at an early age, I think I started setting up something, an easier, softer way of getting through life. And I found my first fascination with a mood-changing substance when I was about 7, when I went around a party at my parents' house and finished off all the glasses. And from that point on, things were never the same. And when I got into my teenage years, drugs just seemed to be a natural progression for me. Somehow I got through military service in the Vietnam War, somehow. And I left military service and found myself with a pretty good habit that I could not continue to feed without doing a lot of crime. And naturally, growing up with a father that was a police officer, I was around guns my whole life. So I did all the things that many of us say we'll never do. Robbing, burglary. I've been arrested 26 times for hanging paper. That was an easier, softer way for me. Write bad checks. In 1971, I went into a military hospital, and the doctor said, "I'm gonna put you on this new drug that we just started using called methadone." So as I put it, in 1971, I became a methadonian, and I found myself on and off that maintenance program for the next 13 years, in and out of treatment programs, learning what to say and how to say it to get through 10, 12, 28-day programs, going to other fellowships and laughing at old gray haired bald people. What did they know? In 1983, I went to a real nice treatment center in New Hampshire, had an indoor pool. I thought I was on vacation. And for the first time on a Saturday afternoon, two people came in from what they called an H&I committee from a fellowship called Narcotics Anonymous. And I listened to what they had to say, and I thought for sure they had gone into the office and read my jacket because the things they talked about pertained to me. It pissed me off a little bit, but I heard something that I would remember later on, because the next 9 months I was in a detox 5 times. And the kind of detox that I would go to during that period would be 5 days of paper slippers and plastic spoons, a couple of B12 shots, and then back on the street. And I couldn't stop. No matter what I tried, I couldn't stop using. On October 14th, 1984, I went into that hospital for the last time. And it was no different than any other time. I didn't have maybe a spiritual awakening or anything like that that was going to allow me to get the message of recovery. But after being there 5 days, my parents and my ex-wife, they brought some clergy people, and they all said the same thing. They said, "You're a failure and you're not going to make it, and we can't help you anymore." And as I left that meeting, a nurse said, "There must be something you can think of that can help you." And I said, "Probably Narcotics Anonymous," because I remembered. And she said, "I'll get somebody for you." And that evening, this person came to that hospital. And back in 1984, there was less than 10 meetings of Narcotics Anonymous in the whole state. And he brought me a handwritten piece of notebook paper with about 7 or 8 addresses. He said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I don't want to use anymore." And he said, "You don't have to." Now, I don't know why I never heard that before, if it was ever told to me, but for the first time, I heard the words, "You don't have to use." And I told him, "I don't know how to do that." And he said, "If you go to these addresses, you'll find people just like us. People have had the same problems and the same lifestyle, and you won't have to use." Well, the good naysayer that I am, I wanted to prove that person wrong. And so when I left that hospital, I went by the first address on the list. It was a Thursday night. There was no lights on at 5 minutes to 8, so I thought he was lying to me. But I went by that building again at 8 o'clock, and there was a couple of cars in the parking lot. So I made sure I parked around the corner down the street in the dark so nobody could see my car. And I walked in the back of this room, and I heard them talking about recovery and Narcotics Anonymous. And I sat in the back for as long as the meeting was going on. And at the end, they said, "We're going to close this meeting with a prayer." So immediately I thought it was a religious movement. Immediately I thought, if I hang out with these people, they'll have me at the airport with a tambourine before long. It wasn't my idea of what I wanted to do. So I remember walking back to my car that first meeting, and the tears were coming out of my eyes, because I knew that I had found something that was different, that it wasn't like all of the other detoxes or anonymous programs that I tried, that this seemed really genuine. So I continued to go to these addresses, and you got to remember, I was kicking 120 milligrams of methadone. I wasn't sleeping very much, but I was going to a meeting every night. I'd sit in the back. I'd get there late, leave early. If anybody asked me who I was, I told them my name was Chuck. I was just visiting from out of town, because I didn't trust anybody. If anybody can identify, I really didn't trust anybody. And then one night at a meeting, like I think all addicts get that insurmountable amount of courage, They were talking about a topic that I thought I had something to say. So I raised my hand and I talked about the topic. And when I was done, the whole room said, "Keep coming back." And I said to myself, they like what I have to say. Maybe I can help these people. And I've been coming back ever since. And I don't know if I help anybody, but I certainly help myself. And I started going to meetings and feeling a little bit better about myself. When I got a year clean, they said this key tag glows in the dark. So the moment I got it, I went in the bathroom and turned the light off to make sure. And it really did glow in the dark. Now, I remember how proud I used to feel when I would go to bed at night and I'd look up on the dresser and I'd see that key tag glowing at night. It was a sense of accomplishment that I hadn't felt before. So, like all good addicts that I know, I thought I knew everything. I had a year clean. I must be some kind of guru in this program. And I started spouting out how much I knew. And early on, this person that had given me that list of addresses, I told him, I asked him what this sponsorship thing was about. And he said, "Well, I'll sponsor you." I said, "Great." But he hardly ever came to this program, so I never had to talk to him. But when I was coming up on 2 years clean, I had that feeling like I still wanted to die. And I knew something was the matter if I was clean and I still wanted to die. And I got to know this little lady who used to always tell me to get honest. And I didn't know what she was talking about. And through her and through a cassette tape of a speaker meeting, I was introduced to my sponsor over 14 years ago now, Bob R. from California. And as we started to work together, he would hurt my feelings very often, especially when I asked him to help me. And he said, "What do you know about the 12 steps?" And I started to tell him how much I knew, and he told me to shut up. But I believe that my journey in recovery began when I effectively started to use a sponsor. See, today I believe in my heart of hearts that the most important thing about this fellowship is sponsorship, because we can't do it by ourselves. We need that person in our life to tell us when we're crazy, tell us when we're doing okay, because I never know how the hell I'm doing. I stay in denial most of the time about most parts of my life. That's what I know best. See, because when I started writing about step one and being powerless over this disease of addiction, I realized that my life was built around a series of things that would prevent me from acting powerless. The justification and rationalization of my behavior constantly covered up the feelings of inadequacy and insecurity that I had my whole life. When I wrote about, the control and manipulation that I used in all my affairs not to feel powerless, I realized that I was really stuck when I admitted that I was powerless, that my life had become unmanageable. Because the unmanageability was a direct correlation with the amount of control that I tried to put on my life. And I learned that the only cure or the only fix or the only thing that would help me would be to get in touch with a loving God, to come to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. And what I have found out in my journey of recovery is that if addicts don't change, their clean date will. See, we have to change. We have to become that person that is loving and caring. The thing that I find that really overwhelms or overcomes other addicts is to love them to death. They don't know what to do when you put love on them. They'd rather argue and fist fight and roll in the dirt, because those are the kind of things that are familiar to us. So when I started to believe in a power greater than myself, I started to make a little bit of headway at turning my will and life over to the care of that power. My problem today still is that I get on my knees every morning and I ask God to help me. But by the time I start walking around, I'm thinking how I can help. I mean, there must be something that I can do. When I started getting this relationship with this higher power, my sponsor said to me, "I think it's time for you to do an inventory." I said, well, I've done 21 inventories. Every time I've been in a treatment program, they asked me to write about myself. So what should I write in this inventory? And he said, how about the truth for a change? Immediately, I was thinking, how do sponsors know those kinds of things? Until I started sponsoring others, and now I know why sponsors know those things. I mean, you ever sit and listen to an addict that's running game? I mean, it doesn't take a scientist to know what's going on. I remember asking sponsees to do the same thing my sponsor asked me, and that's to write for 5 minutes every night. I said, how do you get an inventory done? He said, well, you have to write it. In order to write it, take 5 minutes every night and put the pen on the paper. I've got sponsees today been writing for 2 years, 5 minutes every night, until I asked them to come by the house and bring what they have. And it looks like they wrote one word every night. But it's very difficult, I know, for us as addicts to tell the truth and to put on paper exactly where we're at. Part of that because we probably don't know where we're at. But if you start writing that inventory, for me anyways, I found that when I was able to sit with my sponsor and do a fifth step, it's where the bond between a sponsor and a sponsee takes place. See, addicts love to look good. We love to sound good. I compare it to a swan on a lake that looks so beautiful gliding across the water until you look beneath the water and they're paddling their ass off. And I think that's what we do as addicts sometimes is we try to just paddle hard enough to keep our head above water, not realizing that there's a whole new better life on the other side if we just surrender. And I think that's why they talk about addicts surrender once they leave claw marks all over whatever it is they're trying to surrender. Because where the disease really manifests itself is in step 6. And I found that out because after the inventory, sponsor said, I want you to write down a list of the defects of character that you've identified in that inventory. And my first list of defects was about 13 words. You know, your basic stuff of mistrust and lust and the kind of things that are very prevalent and predominant. Until my sponsor said, you know, what about self loathing and self hatred and self centeredness? And he had a lot of words that started with self. And then the list got up somewhere around 75 or 80 words. What my sponsor asked me to do was to write the dictionary definition of those words and how they affected my life and how my life would be without them. And I found out a lot about what I did not know. See, in speaking to my sponsor, he lived in California for the first 2 years he sponsored me, and I lived in Connecticut. I would call him on the phone and he would say things to me, and I would respond, I know. Everything he asked me or told me, I know. And then one day he said, why don't you write how come you know every goddamn thing? And I found out just how little I really did know. But I found that defects of character, I hate to give anybody the bad news, but they don't go anywhere. You know, we become entirely ready to have God remove them, which means we become familiar with what they are. But if you're like me, defects just go to the back of the line, ready to come back up again when it's their turn. It's kind of like removing defects is removing shoes, and you put the comfortable ones back on many times. And I think that's what we do with our defects is we use the ones that we think are comfortable and that really help us, not knowing that the disease is manifesting itself. Two of the defects that have been brought to my attention lately are the things that stand between relationships, and that's romance and finance. And I think those things get in the way of most of our relationships. So we have to somehow start working on those things. And the way we work on those things is to honestly write how they affect our life and talk with our sponsor about it and get the guidance we need to be thinking outside of our normal train of thought. Because in step 7, what I'm really asking in step 7 is to humbly ask God to remove the shortcomings, to remove the way I act out on these defects. And to practice humility, I have to look at the way I treat other people. You know, I'm very judgmental. I'm very irrational. I look at people like they're different than me, or I feel different than them. And what I find is when I start accepting other people's defects, I start accepting my own. When I start helping others and stop telling everybody what I do for others, then I feel better about myself and I start acting differently. Up to this point in my recovery, things were coming kind of easy for me. I was working these steps, I was talking to my sponsor, I was getting relief from that disease until my sponsor said, I think it's time for you to make an 8-step list of people you have harmed. And I couldn't do it. I really didn't think I owed anybody anything. In one conversation with my sponsor, he said, if your recovery depended on you writing a list, would you do it? I said, absolutely. He said, your recovery depends on you making an 8-step list. And so I got busy and I started writing down people in my life and the exact nature of the wrong. And I was devastated at first, looking at all the people that I had harmed intentionally, especially when it came to family members. I started looking at my relationships with employers, although I didn't have a whole lot before I got clean. I started looking at the relationships I had with women, relationships I had with coworkers, education, police officers, all those kinds of things. And I started to look at what my part was in those relationships. The thing that bothered me most was a couple of pages of people that were deceased that I would never see again. And it troubled me to the point that when I was done writing my 8-step list, I asked my sponsor what I was going to do with these people that were deceased. And he told me to help newcomers so they wouldn't have to die. And so I guess that was another way that kind of propelled me to get totally involved with H&I, totally involved with service. It gave me the ability, I believe, to start helping others when they asked me to sponsor them. I believe you have to have something to give away, and I believe what we give away in sponsorship is the 12 steps. So I started making direct amends from the list that I had. And some of the amends that I continually talk about are probably the ones that mean the most. My mother and father are still alive. God bless them, and they live in Connecticut, and I was there yesterday to see them. And when I went to them to make a 9th-step amend, and I asked them to put a dollar figure on the money that I owed them, because I'd like to pay them back, my father said, you'll never live long enough. And you know how mothers are. My mother started crying and said, we don't want anything from you. Boy, was I relieved. Because I still had that sense of value that, now that I'm clean, the board should be wiped clean. We'll start again. And so I went to my sponsor and said, they don't want anything from me. And he said, do you feel good about that? I said, yeah. So what he taught me in that lesson was that I do not make amends so other people love me more or think more highly of me. I make amends so I can live within my own skin. So the second amend he told me to make, he said, do you love your brother? I said, of course. He said, go tell him. Now, my brother is a year older than me, and he's quote unquote what we would call a normie. But back when I was doing my thing, I knew his social security number and where he lived and where he worked. And unfortunately, he got arrested a lot. And so I went to my brother, and when I first looked at him, the words got caught in my throat. So I went in the bathroom and I got on my knees and I came back out and I said, Dave, I love you. He said, I know. In my mind, I thought he forgave me for all the crap that I put him through. It wasn't until about 8 years later when he came through Los Angeles and spent the night with me. We went to dinner. Over dinner, he said, I finally forgive you. So a loving God had a way to give me about 8 years of freedom at family get-togethers thinking my brother forgave me. But, especially with relatives, they forgive, but they don't forget, do they? When I went to my sister and I said, that brand new vacuum cleaner that disappeared when you got married? I'd like to buy you a vacuum cleaner. She said, I already have one. I'd like you to come and vacuum my house. Sisters are like that, I guess. One of the most intense things that has happened to me, not only in doing 9-step amends, but in recovery, about 6 or 7 years ago, I went back, it was probably longer than that now. I went back to Connecticut after moving to Los Angeles to be in one of my sponsees' weddings And when I arrived, my mother said, "This letter came for you this week. Were you expecting something?" And I said, "No." And I opened this letter and it was a picture of a young lady. And the letter said, "You don't know me, but you're my father." And I met my daughter when she was 19 years old. And I remembered 19 years before that going to court from the lockup, being brought upstairs in front of a judge and signing away parental permission for this child. I wanted nothing to do with her because I was young and I did not want the responsibility. Her mother and I were in a very short term relationship, but I got a chance to meet my daughter. And although I don't look old enough, I have a grandson from her now. So our paths crossed and we talk to each other at least once a week. She's a beautiful codependent, doesn't use drugs herself. But I have found out that our children, if they don't use drugs, they're very codependent. They want to take care of us still, probably just waiting for us to fall. Because I think that the history of addicts that people remember as once an addict, always an addict. Bullshit. I think that we all recover one day at a time in Narcotics Anonymous. What greater place can we come together? I sat here looking at the introduction and looking at the banners that are so beautiful, the time and the effort and the thought that goes into putting on these kind of events so we all can come together and share a common bond, recovery. I came here to stop using drugs. I got so much more after getting here. In step 10, we try to do that thing that is so important in this fellowship, and that's continuing to take our inventory. God knows everybody else takes it. So we continue to take our inventory so we can admit that when we're wrong. Try to admit it. But for me, I don't go around telling people I'm sorry all the time. I got tired of people saying, "You're right, you are sorry." So I started practicing talking to sponsor before I do that. I really try not to tell people I'm sorry unless I really have a solid intention. I'm not going to do that again. Because after I start this, what they call maintenance of things and looking at myself, I start working on step 11, which is so esoterical, I think, at times when I look at it, sought through prayer and meditation. I'm listening to like the Beatles or something, to improve our conscious contact with that God of our understanding, praying only for knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. And I think step 11 is a lot about courage. Because I think that once we stay clean a little while, we start knowing not to go left when our head tells us to. We get that little voice inside us saying, "I wouldn't do that," but we're going to try it one more time. The insanity. For me, I have to take a few moments every day to kind of set aside, and that's my prayer and meditation. And for me, I go to work early in the morning because living in Los Angeles, you don't want to be on a freeway at 7 a.m. You'll be there forever, kind of like between here and Montreal. So I leave work early in the morning and I leave the radio in the car off and I try to talk to my higher power and listen to see what he has to say and ask for the courage to do the right thing. Because when we arrive at step 12 and it talks about having had a spiritual awakening, and I know newcomers get those sometimes when they hang around Starbucks too long. Spiritual awakening should not be caffeine induced, but I know sometimes it is. But a spiritual awakening to me is just like our literature tells us. It's a new direction that we find as a result of the 12 steps. And the message we carry is a message of recovery through practicing the 12 steps of Narcotics Anonymous. The thing that I believe that I fall short, and I think a lot of us do, is practicing principles in all our affairs, not some of our affairs. It's really brought very clear to me when I listen to people I sponsor and their significant other says, "Boy, you people in NA hug and put your arms around each other and I love you." And then you come home and act like a jerk. We go to work and we try to get over on people. We try to keep the upper hand on people because we don't have the faith necessary that God is going to take care of us. I think the lack of faith is the thing that addicts suffer from the most. We don't understand that loving and caring God is the only way to get us from point A to point B. I want to thank the committee once again for inviting me to be with you this weekend. I want to thank those of you that sat for a couple of hours before I started speaking for hanging in there and sticking it out with me. I really appreciate that. I really love Narcotics Anonymous with all my heart, and I know you do too. So please keep coming back for me. I love you.